A chance encounter in the cold. The early morning air was crisp, with winter's icy fingers tracing through the streets of Washington, D.C. The city, usually alive with the constant hum of movement, was momentarily still. The coming hours would bring crowds, excitement, and history in the making. But for now, the world outside remained quiet, almost eerily so. Inside a sleek black SUV, Melania Trump sat with poise, gazing out at the cityscape, her breath fogged slightly against the cold window as the vehicle rolled smoothly past the towering monuments and government buildings. This was the capital of the free world, and in just a few hours, her husband would once again take the presidential oath. Her mind was already occupied with the day's schedule. Every moment of the inauguration was choreographed down to the second. The morning would start with a prayer service at St. John's Episcopal Church, followed by a private meeting at Blair House, then the grand procession to the Capitol. As First Lady, she had to be perfect, graceful, composed, and, above all, present. A quiet sigh left her lips as she smoothed the fabric of her navy coat. Fashion, as always, would be scrutinized today. Every detail had been chosen with care. The silver brooch on her lapel, the wide-brimmed hat that would shield her from the piercing winter light. Even now, she could imagine the flashing of cameras, the whispering voices of commentators analyzing every stitch of her appearance. As they approached the Regal Washington, an exclusive hotel reserved for high-profile guests, the usual security detail stood at attention. Secret Service agents, dressed in dark suits and earpieces, patrolled the perimeter. It was a stark contrast to the warmth inside her vehicle. As the car slowed near the entrance, something unusual caught Melania's attention. A small figure curled beneath an umbrella, half hidden in the shadows of the parking lot. The oversized umbrella, tilted at an odd angle, barely shielded the boy from the elements. His blonde hair stuck out in messy tufts, damp from the previous night's rain. His jacket, clearly too thin for the cold, clung to his frame. A small, worn-out backpack lay beside him, its contents barely visible: a plastic water bottle, a few crumpled snack wrappers. Melania's heart clenched. "Ma'am," the driver spoke softly, "everything is secure. Would you like to proceed inside?" She hesitated, her gaze locked on the sleeping child. She had seen images of homelessness before, pictures on the news, stories about struggling families, statistics that were brought to her attention during meetings about child welfare. But those were numbers, abstractions. This was real. "Who is that boy?" she asked. The lead Secret Service agent, a tall man named Colton, followed her gaze and immediately stiffened. "We'll handle it, ma'am. It could be a security risk." Melania's eyebrows furrowed. "He's a child." Colton didn't argue. Instead, he gestured toward two other agents, who approached the boy with careful precision. As they neared, the boy stirred. His eyes fluttered open, glassy with exhaustion and fear. For a moment, confusion clouded his face as he took in his surroundings: the towering agents, the gleaming vehicles, the imposing hotel entrance. Then panic set in. He scrambled backward, his small hands gripping the edges of his soaked jacket. "Wait," Melania said, stepping out of the car before anyone could stop her. The cold hit her instantly, seeping through her gloves, but she ignored it. She moved toward the boy with measured steps, lowering herself into a crouch just a few feet away. "You're safe," she said gently. "No one will hurt you." The boy's breathing was ragged. His small frame trembled from more than just the cold. Melania saw the hesitation in his eyes, the instinct to run. She softened her expression, offering a small smile. "My name is Melania. Can you tell me yours?" The boy didn't answer. His eyes darted toward the agents, still hovering close by. His fingers gripped the fabric of his jacket even tighter, as if it could protect him from whatever was coming next. "Are you hungry?" she asked, shifting her approach. The boy hesitated. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Melania turned to Colton. "I want to bring him inside." The agent exchanged a glance with his team. "Ma'am, I strongly advise against that. We don't know anything about him. This could be a setup." She straightened. "I understand the risks, but I will not leave a child alone in the cold." Her tone left no room for argument. Colton sighed but nodded. "Then we do this carefully." One of the agents approached the boy again, this time slower, with hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "Hey, kid," he said, voice softer than before. "Come with us. We've got food inside." The boy swallowed hard. His eyes flicked to Melania, searching her face for something. Trust, maybe. She reached out her gloved hand. "You don't have to be afraid." A long pause stretched between them. Then, finally, the boy reached out and placed his cold, trembling hand in hers. Melania's heart ached as she gently helped him stand. His legs were wobbly, likely from hunger and exhaustion. Without thinking, she pulled off her cashmere scarf and wrapped it around him. The boy flinched slightly at the kindness, but didn't pull away. As they guided him toward the hotel entrance, Melania felt something shift inside her. The grandeur of the day ahead, the ceremony, the cameras, the expectations, suddenly seemed distant, insignificant in comparison to this small, fragile life now walking beside her. And deep in her heart, she knew this was just the beginning. A boy with no name. As the hotel doors swung open, a wave of warmth rushed to meet them, contrasting sharply with the icy morning air. The lobby of the Regal Washington was a vision of opulence. Gold chandeliers cast soft light over the marble floors, and a crackling fireplace in the far corner added a sense of luxury. High-profile guests milled about in elegant suits and tailored dresses, their conversations hushed but urgent. This was the heart of the nation's power, where the elite gathered in the hours leading up to the inauguration. And yet, amidst all this grandeur, all Melania could focus on was the trembling boy beside her. She felt his small fingers tighten around hers as his wide eyes darted around the unfamiliar space. His clothes were damp, his hair a tangled mess. He stood out in stark contrast to the pristine world around him. Joy, her personal assistant, rushed forward the moment she spotted them. "Mrs. Trump," she whispered urgently, glancing at the Secret Service agents before focusing on the boy. "Who is this?" Melania turned to her. "I found him outside, sleeping under an umbrella." Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet intensity in her tone. Joy's eyebrows knitted together in concern. "Should I call child services?" Melania hesitated. She knew that was the logical thing to do, but something inside her resisted. The boy had barely spoken. He was still afraid, still unsure of what would happen next. If they called the authorities too soon, he might try to run again. Instead, she crouched down so she was eye level with him. "Would you like something warm to drink?" she asked gently. "Maybe some hot chocolate." The boy swallowed, his throat botting. He gave a tiny nod, still clutching the scarf she had given him. Melania turned back to Joy. "Let's take him somewhere private. A quiet space." Joy, ever efficient, quickly led them toward a small VIP lounge off to the side of the lobby. The room was decorated in deep mahogany and soft leather chairs, a sanctuary away from the noise of the outside world. As they stepped inside, one of the hotel staff members arrived with a silver tray carrying hot chocolate, tea, and a plate of buttered toast. The boy eyed the food with a hunger so raw it made Melania's chest tighten. "Go ahead," she encouraged, taking the seat beside him. At first, he hesitated. Then, as if some internal wall crumbled, he grabbed a piece of toast and took a ravenous bite. Crumbs fell onto his lap, but he didn't care. Melania watched in silence, letting him eat. She had learned, over the years, that sometimes silence spoke louder than words. Finally, when he had finished the toast and taken several careful sips of the hot chocolate, she spoke. "What's your name?" The boy stiffened. For a moment, he didn't answer. He simply stared at the cup in his hands, as if hoping it would somehow answer for him. "Sweetheart," she said softly. It's okay. You're safe here. His lips parted slightly. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, Ethan. Melania nodded, offering a reassuring smile. That's a very nice name, Ethan. He shifted in his seat, as if trying to decide whether or not to trust her. Are you the lady from the TV? He finally asked. Melania smiled again, this time with a touch of amusement. Yes. Ethan's fingers curled around his cup. You're the president's wife. She nodded. I am. He lowered his gaze, his small hands tightening around the warm mug. He hesitated. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost in the crackling of the fireplace, he said, I just wanted to see it. The inauguration. The big day. Melania exchanged a glance with Joy, who was watching with cautious interest. You mean, you ran away to see it? Ethan nodded slowly. A part of Melania wanted to scold him. Running away was dangerous. The city was no place for a child to be alone, especially in the middle of winter. But another part of her, the part that had spent years observing people, understanding their fears and desires, recognized something deeper in Ethan's story. There was more he wasn't saying. She leaned forward slightly. Where is your family? Ethan flinched at the question. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and unspoken. Joy shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Even the Secret Service agents stationed at the door seemed more alert. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan whispered, I don't have one. Melania's breath caught. He sniffled, rubbing his sleeve across his nose. My dad was in the army, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He used to tell me stories about the president, about how important he was, about how people like him fought for our country. A lump formed in Melania's throat. My dad died, Ethan continued. His fingers twisted the hem of his jacket. A long time ago. Melania swallowed hard. And your mother? Ethan's eyes filled with something unreadable. She left. A deep sadness settled over the room. Melania knew, in that moment, that Ethan had been alone for far longer than just last night. Joy, ever the practical one, cleared her throat. Mrs. Trump, we really should notify the proper authorities. There are procedures. I know, Melania said, her voice firm. She turned back to Ethan. Are you staying at an orphanage? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Hope Haven. Melania exhaled. She knew the place. It was one of the many institutions that handled abandoned and displaced children. Some were well run, but others, not so much. Do they take care of you there? She asked carefully. Ethan shrugged. It's okay. Which, in her experience, meant no. Melania sat back, thinking. She had 1,000 things to do today. She was already late for her next engagement, but as she looked at Ethan, this small boy who had risked everything just to catch a glimpse of history, she knew she couldn't simply walk away. She reached over and gently took his hand in hers. Ethan, she said softly, would you like to come with me today? His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. Really? She nodded. I can't promise you everything, but I can promise you that you'll get to see the inauguration. Up close. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes. I'd really get to go. Melania smiled. Yes, but you have to stay by my side. No running away. No disappearing. Do you understand? Ethan nodded so hard his blonde hair flopped into his face. I promise. Joy looked like she wanted to argue, but Melania silenced her with a single glance. Then it's settled, she said, standing. Let's get you something warm to wear. As she led Ethan toward the hotel boutique, a thought crossed her mind. Perhaps in the middle of all the politics, all the speeches, and all the history being made today, this was what truly mattered. A small act of kindness. A boy who just wanted to belong. And a promise to give him something to hold on to. A future. A boy in the halls of power. The boutique inside the Regal Washington was a luxury shopping haven, with pristine glass cases and racks of designer clothing. Every item in the store, from the tailored suits to the delicate scarves, had been carefully curated for the wealthiest guests in Washington. But at that moment, none of that mattered to Melania. Her focus was entirely on Ethan. The boy followed hesitantly, his fingers gripping the edge of the cashmere scarf she had given him earlier. He looked so out of place among the polished mannequins and silk-lined shelves, his damp, oversized jacket hanging from his small frame, his shoes caked with dried mud from the parking lot. Joy, who had been trailing them, leaned in. "Mrs. Trump, we don't have much time. If we don't leave soon." "I know," Melania interrupted, already scanning the shelves. "We won't be long." A saleswoman, impeccably dressed in a fitted blazer and pearl earrings, approached them with a professional smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Trump. How can I assist you today?" Melania gestured toward Ethan. "He needs something warm to wear." The woman hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course. Right this way." Ethan's fingers twitched against the scarf, and Melania noticed how his shoulders tensed as they walked deeper into the store. "Do you like blue or black?" she asked him gently. Ethan blinked at her. "Huh. Your jacket. Would you like a blue one or a black one?" For a moment, he just stared at her as if no one had ever asked him a question like that before. Then, cautiously, he said, "Black." Melania nodded, signaling to the saleswoman. Within minutes, they had found a thick, insulated jacket, along with a warm hat and gloves. Ethan, clearly unused to such fine clothes, ran his hands over the material hesitantly. "Go on," Melania encouraged. "Try it on." Ethan pulled the jacket over his arms. It fit perfectly. Not too tight, not too loose. When he zipped it up, he looked down at himself as if he had transformed into someone else entirely. Melania smiled. "You look very handsome." A shy, almost embarrassed grin spread across Ethan's face. He turned to see himself in the mirror, his reflection now showing something other than a lost child. Confidence, warmth, hope. Melania turned to the saleswoman. "We'll take it." As they left the boutique, Ethan clung to the warmth of his new jacket. He looked up at Melania, his blue eyes filled with something unreadable. "Thank you," he whispered. She gave his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You're welcome." The ride to the White House. The morning traffic had begun to thicken as they pulled away from the hotel, escorted by a fleet of black SUVs. Inside the luxurious Rolls-Royce, Ethan sat beside Melania, his fingers still gripping the zipper of his jacket. Across from them, Joy checked her tablet, listing off the schedule for the day. "Mrs. Trump, we're already behind," Joy said, frowning. "Blair House is expecting you, and the president's team will be waiting at St. John's Episcopal Church. After that, we head straight to the Capitol for the ceremony." Melania nodded but said nothing. She had already decided. Ethan would be with her for the day, no matter how unconventional it was. As they drove through Washington, Ethan's face remained pressed against the window. "I've never been this close before," he said in awe. "To the White House?" Melania asked. Ethan shook his head. "To all of this." He gestured toward the grand buildings, the towering monuments. "I see it on TV, but I never thought I'd be here." Melania studied him carefully. She could see it now. The longing in his eyes, the way he held himself like he was afraid someone would realize he didn't belong. But he did belong. Not just here, in the back of this luxury car, but in the world of opportunity, of possibility. "You know," Melania said, "the White House isn't just a place for presidents. It belongs to all Americans." Ethan glanced at her, clearly unsure whether to believe her. "Even kids like me." Melania reached out and adjusted his scarf. "Especially kids like you." The boy fell silent, his fingers still toying with his jacket. Then, hesitantly, he asked, "What happens after today?" Melania paused. She knew what he was asking. Would he go back to the orphanage? Would she forget about him once the cameras were gone? She wasn't sure how to answer. So instead, she said, "We'll see." And somehow, that seemed to be enough. A seat among history. When they arrived at the White House, the energy of the day had already begun to build. Staff members bustled about, carrying last-minute preparations. Secret Service agents stood at attention, their earpieces crackling with constant updates. As they stepped out of the vehicle, Ethan hesitated. He looked up at the grand building in front of him, the place he had only ever seen on television. Melania placed a gentle hand on his back. "Come." With cautious steps, Ethan followed her through the entrance, his breath hitching as he took in the opulent hallways. The polished floors gleamed beneath the chandeliers, portraits of past presidents lining the walls. Every step felt surreal. Then, as they moved toward the gathering room, a group of dignitaries turned. The First Lady of the United States had arrived, and beside her stood a small boy in a brand-new black jacket, looking very much like someone who had stumbled into a world far bigger than he had ever imagined. Eyes turned toward Ethan. Some whispered. Others simply looked confused. Joy hurried forward, whispering urgently, "Mrs. Trump." They weren't expecting him. Melania lifted her chin. "They are now." Without hesitation, she guided Ethan toward a row of reserved seats near the front, right beside where she and the president would be seated during the upcoming ceremony. Ethan looked around, his eyes wide. "You're sitting here?" he asked in disbelief. Melania nodded. "And so are you." The boy swallowed hard. "This is crazy." Melania smiled. "No, Ethan. This is history." As the ceremony began, as the president was sworn in, as the cameras flashed and the world watched, the small boy from the parking lot sat beside the most powerful people in the country. He wasn't invisible anymore, and he would never be again. The weight of a promise. The air inside the White House buzzed with energy. The grandeur of the East Room, with its towering chandeliers and gleaming gold curtains, stood in stark contrast to the streets Ethan had wandered just hours earlier. Staff members hurried past, finalizing last-minute details before the official procession to the Capitol. Outside, the muffled hum of the growing crowd filtered in through the thick windows. The world was watching. But inside the grand building, amidst the highest echelons of power, a small boy sat quietly beside the First Lady of the United States. Ethan still hadn't fully processed where he was. He ran his fingers along the smooth fabric of his new jacket, his body stiff with unease. This place, the towering ceilings, the perfectly polished floors, the voices speaking in hushed but urgent tones, felt like something out of a dream. It was a world he had seen on television, one that seemed untouchable. And yet, somehow, he was here, sitting beside her. Melania Trump glanced down at him, her expression unreadable but not unkind. She could see it, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clutched the arms of his chair as if he were afraid someone might suddenly tell him to leave. She leaned in slightly. "Are you all right?" Ethan nodded stiffly. "Yeah." Melania studied him. "You don't have to be nervous." Ethan swallowed hard. I don't think I should be here." A small smile touched her lips. "Why not?" He looked at her like the answer was obvious. "Because I'm just me." Melania's smile grew softer. "And I am just me. Yet here we are." Ethan fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve. "I don't understand why you helped me." Melania tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Because I saw you." Ethan frowned. "Other people saw me too." She nodded. "Yes, but they didn't see you." The boy didn't know how to respond to that. A moment of silence passed between them before Joy's voice interrupted, her tone urgent. "Mrs. Trump, we need to head to the motorcade soon." She glanced at Ethan, clearly hesitant. I still need to speak with Child Services. They were expecting him back at the orphanage by now." Melania's expression darkened slightly, though her voice remained composed. "Have they sent anyone yet?" Joy checked her phone. "Not yet, but I told them he was safe." Ethan's breath caught at the mention of Child Services. His hands tightened around the arms of the chair. He looked up at Melania, panic flickering in his eyes. "Do I have to go back?" Melania sighed. "For now." Ethan dropped his gaze to the floor. He nodded, but the disappointment in his posture was unmistakable. Melania watched him carefully. There was something about the way he folded into himself, something far too familiar. Something she had seen in herself once. She made a quiet decision. Standing, she straightened her coat and gestured for Ethan to do the same. "Come," she said. Ethan blinked at her in confusion. "Where?" "To the inauguration." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really?" Melania nodded. "I promised, didn't I?" For the first time that morning, Ethan smiled. The motorcade to the Capitol. The ride to the Capitol was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. Seated in a presidential SUV, surrounded by a fleet of armored vehicles and police escorts, he could feel the power of it, the weight of history moving through the streets of Washington. He peered out the tinted windows at the crowds lining the sidewalks. Hundreds, no, thousands, of people had gathered, bundled in thick coats and waving flags. Their voices blurred together in an excited hum, an electric anticipation that filled the air. The president's limousine, a massive black beast of a car, led the procession. Secret Service agents marched alongside the vehicles, their eyes scanning the crowds with practiced vigilance. The security was tighter than Ethan had ever seen in his life. Melania sat beside him, perfectly composed as always. Ethan turned to her, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever get scared?" Melania glanced at him. "Of what?" He hesitated. "Of all of this." He gestured vaguely to the outside world. "Of everything." Melania considered the question for a moment before answering. "Fear is normal, but I don't let it control me." Ethan thought about that. "I think I'd be scared all the time if I were you." She smiled slightly. "And yet you were brave enough to come here on your own." Ethan blushed, looking away. That was different. Melania shook her head. "Courage is not the absence of fear, Ethan. It is facing it anyway." Ethan wasn't sure he understood entirely, but something about her words stuck with him. As the motorcade slowed, the reality of where they were heading settled over him. He was about to witness something that most people could only dream of. The inauguration of the President of the United States. And he had a front row seat. A moment in history. The Capitol steps were packed with some of the most powerful people in the country. Senators, world leaders, celebrities, and journalists, all gathered for this historic moment. The seats reserved for the president's family and closest allies were positioned near the front, just behind the main podium where the oath of office would be taken. Melania led Ethan toward their seats, and immediately, heads turned. People whispered. Some frowned. Others simply looked curious. But Melania ignored them. She guided Ethan to a seat beside her, making it clear that he belonged. Ethan, for his part, felt like he was dreaming. He barely noticed the cold anymore. The sheer magnitude of the event overwhelmed him. The sea of people stretching as far as the eye could see, the giant American flags draped across the Capitol building, the cameras broadcasting everything to millions of viewers around the world. And here he was, a boy from nowhere. A boy who had slept in a parking lot last night. Now sitting beside the First Lady of the United States. The ceremony began. Ethan barely breathed as the Chief Justice stepped forward. The president placed his hand on the Bible, his voice steady as he recited the oath of office. The crowd erupted into applause, a thunderous wave of sound that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. And then, as the newly sworn-in president turned to face the nation, his eyes briefly flickered toward Ethan. Ethan froze. For the briefest of moments, the president's gaze locked with his. There was no frown, no confusion, just a flicker of understanding. Then, he turned back to the crowd. Ethan swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, he felt seen. Truly seen. A future unknown. As the ceremony ended and the attendees began to disperse, Ethan remained in his seat, still overwhelmed by everything he had witnessed. Melania stood beside him, adjusting her gloves. "Are you ready?" Ethan looked up at her. "For what?" "To go home." His stomach twisted. Home. Where was that exactly? Melania must have seen the hesitation in his face. She sighed, then reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. A business card. She pressed it into his hand. "If you ever need help," she said softly, "call." Ethan stared at the card. Her name was printed in elegant script. Below it, a personal contact number. His throat tightened. "You mean it?" Melania met his gaze. "I don't make promises I can't keep." Ethan clutched the card tightly, his fingers trembling. For the first time in a long time, he had hope. Real hope. And somehow, that changed everything. A home worth waiting for. The ceremony had ended, and the sea of people slowly began to dissipate. The Capitol steps, once brimming with anticipation, were now a flurry of movement. Staff members directing guests, Secret Service agents ensuring security, and journalists scrambling to capture every last soundbite of the historic day. Yet for Ethan, the world felt strangely still. Even as powerful figures brushed past him, their voices merging into a distant hum, he remained rooted in his seat. He clutched the small business card in his hand as if it were a lifeline, a promise, a way out. For a boy who had spent years feeling invisible, the weight of that promise was almost too much to comprehend. Melania Trump stood beside him, her navy coat dress fluttering slightly in the cold breeze. She had spent the last few moments watching Ethan, her expression unreadable. But she knew what was going through his mind. She recognized that quiet desperation, the uncertainty of what came next, and she wasn't about to let him walk away without an answer. A farewell, or something more. Joy approached with her ever-present clipboard, her face drawn with concern. "Mrs. Trump, Child Services is waiting at the White House. They're expecting Ethan soon." Melania nodded, but something in her gaze remained firm. She turned to Ethan, who had gone stiff at the mention of Child Services. He was gripping the business card even tighter now. "I have to go back." His voice was small. Melania sighed. For now. Ethan dropped his gaze to the ground. For a moment, Melania considered telling him what she was thinking, what she wanted to do. But this wasn't the time for promises she wasn't yet certain she could keep. Instead, she placed a gloved hand gently on his shoulder. "Come. Let's not keep them waiting." The ride back to the White House was quiet. Ethan didn't press his face against the window this time. He didn't stare in awe at the historic streets of Washington. Instead, he sat still, his small hands resting in his lap, as if trying to make himself as small as possible. Melania hated seeing that. He had just witnessed history, had just been a part of history, and now that excitement, that wonder, was already fading. She wasn't going to let that happen. A proposal behind closed doors. When they arrived at the White House, they were greeted by Marie Schatz, the social worker from Child Services. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes, Marie greeted Melania with a polite nod before turning to Ethan. "Hello, Ethan," she said kindly. "It's good to see you safe." Ethan barely responded. Marie straightened, clearly aware of the tension. "I'll take him from here, Mrs. Trump. Thank you for your help today." Melania held up a hand. "Wait." Joy and the Secret Service agents exchanged uneasy glances. This was not part of the schedule. Marie hesitated. "Mrs. Trump." Melania inhaled deeply, then turned to Ethan. "Would you like to stay?" Ethan's head snapped up so fast, it was as if he thought he had misheard her. "Stay." Melania nodded. "For now. At least for tonight." Joy coughed slightly, stepping forward. "Mrs. Trump, I don't think." Melania silenced her with a single glance. Then she turned back to Marie. "Is there a legal way to make this arrangement, even temporarily?" Marie blinked, clearly thrown off. "You mean you want to take him in?" Yes, Melania said simply. The room fell silent. Ethan looked between the adults, his eyes wide, his breath coming quicker now. You mean I don't have to go back? Melania looked at Marie expectantly. The social worker sighed, rubbing her forehead. It's complicated. He's under the care of Hope Haven. Normally, foster placements take time, paperwork. Melania raised a hand. But if I wanted to offer temporary guardianship? Marie hesitated, as if weighing her options. There is an emergency placement protocol, but it's not common. Then start the process, Melania said. Ethan's lips parted, but no words came out. His brain struggled to keep up with what was happening. She wanted him to stay. Not just for an hour, not just for a meal, but for the night. Maybe longer. A place to rest. That evening, for the first time in a long time, Ethan slept in a bed that wasn't a stiff mattress in a crowded orphanage. His new jacket was draped over a chair, his small frame tucked beneath heavy blankets in one of the guest suites of the White House. The room was too big, too elegant, too much like something from a movie. But it was warm and safe. Melania stood by the doorway, watching the boy's breathing even out as sleep finally claimed him. Joy stood beside her, arms crossed, expression full of barely concealed skepticism. You know this isn't a long-term solution, right? Melania exhaled. I know. You can't just keep him. Melania's lips pressed together. I don't intend to. But I won't send him away without knowing he has somewhere safe to go. Joy studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, she sighed. Well, then I'll start making calls in the morning. Melania nodded but didn't move. She stayed at the doorway a little longer, watching the boy sleep. Something told her this wasn't the end of the story. Not even close. A future worth fighting for. The next morning, Ethan awoke slowly, blinking against the golden light that filtered through the grand windows of the White House. For a moment, he forgot where he was. And then he remembered. His heart pounded. He sat up quickly, looking around, almost expecting everything to disappear. That maybe it had all been a dream. But it wasn't. He was still here. There was a knock at the door. Ethan froze. Then, cautiously, he slid out of bed and padded over, hesitating before turning the handle. Melania Trump stood on the other side, dressed impeccably in a morning ensemble, her expression calm. Good morning, Ethan. The boy swallowed. Morning. She studied him for a moment before speaking. I have a question for you, she said finally. Ethan nodded slowly. Melania exhaled, then crouched slightly so she was eye level with him. What do you want to do? The question stunned him. No one had ever asked him that before. Not like this. Not with the expectation that his answer mattered. Ethan's mouth felt dry. His mind raced. What did he want? To go back. To stay. He wasn't sure. All he knew was this. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like just another kid lost in the system. For the first time, someone had seen him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A future rewritten. Ethan hesitated at the doorway, staring up at Melania Trump as if she had asked him the hardest question in the world. What do you want to do? His fingers curled slightly against the doorframe, his mind racing. He had spent so long just surviving, drifting from place to place, going through the motions at Hope Haven, avoiding trouble where he could. No one had ever asked him what he wanted before. Not like this. Melania waited patiently, her expression unreadable but gentle. Ethan swallowed hard. His heart pounded against his ribs. Can I stay? The words came out hesitant, unsure. He half expected her to say no. Melania studied him for a long moment before speaking. For now, she said softly. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't realized how badly he needed to hear those words. She stood straight, smoothing her coat. Come, she said, motioning for him to follow. We have a lot to discuss. Decisions behind closed doors. The White House felt different in the morning light. The halls, which had been buzzing with officials and dignitaries the night before, were quieter now. The staff moved with purpose, but there was less urgency in their steps. Ethan followed Melania through the corridors, his head on a constant swivel. He still couldn't believe he was here. Every few steps, someone would glance at him, their expressions unreadable. He could hear their whispered questions. Who is that boy? Why is he here? Is he staying? But Melania didn't stop to answer them. She led him toward a large study, where Joy and Marie Schatz, the social worker from Child Services, were already waiting. Marie looked tired, her hair pulled into a neat but hurried bun. Papers were spread out before her on the grand mahogany desk, her pen tapping against them as they entered. Mrs. Trump, Marie greeted, standing up. Then she glanced at Ethan, her lips pressing together in thought. I was surprised to receive your request so soon. Melania gestured toward the chairs. Please, sit. Ethan hesitated but took a seat beside her, shifting uncomfortably under Marie's gaze. I assume this meeting is to discuss Ethan's placement, Marie continued. Melania nodded. Yes. Marie sighed, folding her hands on the desk. Mrs. Trump, I understand your concern for Ethan, but as I mentioned yesterday, fostering isn't a simple process. It requires. I know, Melania interrupted, her voice composed. That is why I asked for this meeting. I want to discuss all options available. Ethan tensed beside her. What did that mean? Was she sending him back? Was this all just temporary? Marie exhaled. He has a legal guardian, Hope Haven. If you're suggesting a transfer, it would take time. A background check, home studies, psychological assessments. She adjusted her glasses, looking at Ethan. And of course, Ethan would have to agree. Ethan's breath hitched. They were asking him. His fingers dug into his jacket, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Ethan, Marie said gently, this is your choice too. You can return to Hope Haven, where you'll continue school and eventually be placed in a permanent home. Or, she glanced at Melania. You can stay here, for now. The room felt impossibly small. Ethan felt all their eyes on him. The old fears rose up in his throat. He was a kid from nowhere. A kid with nothing. This was the White House. What if they changed their minds? What if they decided he wasn't worth the trouble? He looked at Melania, searching her face for any sign that she was just being nice, that this wasn't real. But she wasn't looking at him with pity. She wasn't even looking at him like a problem to be solved. She was just waiting, giving him the choice. And that was something he had never had before. Ethan swallowed hard, gripping the edges of his chair. I want to stay, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Marie sighed, rubbing her forehead. Then we'll have to begin the paperwork. Melania nodded, her expression unreadable. Then let's begin. A new normal. The next few days were unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. The White House was nothing like the orphanage. It was massive, elegant, overwhelming in every way. The kitchen staff prepared food he had only seen in fancy restaurants on TV. The hallways stretched on forever, filled with rooms he would probably never even step foot in. But the strangest part, people knew his name. The staff, the security guards, even Joy, who still looked skeptical about the entire situation, addressed him like he belonged. It was weird. The first night, he had barely slept, too afraid that if he closed his eyes, he'd wake up back in his bunk bed at Hope Haven. But morning came, and nothing changed. And that was when he realized. This wasn't a dream. This was real. For now, an unlikely family. One morning, a knock came at Ethan's door. He opened it hesitantly, only to find Melania standing there, holding something behind her back. Good morning, she greeted. Ethan rubbed his eyes. Morning. Melania studied him for a moment before stepping inside. I have something for you. Ethan frowned as she pulled out a neatly wrapped box and handed it to him. He hesitated before untying the ribbon. Inside was a red baseball cap. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just any cap. It was one of the official inauguration hats, the same ones worn by the president's closest supporters. Only this one was signed. By her. By him. The president's signature was scrawled across the brim in thick black ink alongside Melania's. Ethan ran his fingers over the fabric, barely breathing. "This is for me." Melania smiled. "I thought you might want a way to remember that you were part of history." Ethan swallowed hard. His voice cracked. He quickly looked away, rubbing his sleeve across his eyes. Melania knelt slightly so she was eye level with him. "You belong here, Ethan." His lip trembled. "For how long?" Melania exhaled softly. "As long as you want to be." And that was when Ethan knew. For the first time in his life, he had something he never thought possible. A home. A family. A future worth waiting for. Epilogue. A life rewritten. Months later, the media would catch wind of the story. The First Lady takes in an orphaned boy, a White House guardian angel. There would be interviews, speculation, debates over whether it was proper or appropriate. But for Ethan, none of that mattered. Because on that cold winter morning, when he had curled up beneath an umbrella in a parking lot, he had been no one. Now he had a place in history. And more importantly, a place to call home.